Rancher's Buried Secret. Caroline Carey Boone had spent her life upholding the law, not questioning it. But when Colt Dawson, a wanted man with a past tangled in hers, was locked in her jail, she felt her careful world start to shake. He smirked from behind the bars, his voice rough as gravel. "You gonna keep me in here forever, Sheriff?" he murmured. "Or you finally gonna admit you don't want me to leave?" Chapter 1. The Badge and the Burden. The desert sun beat down on Serenity, Arizona, with a ferocity that mirrored the turmoil brewing inside Caroline Carey Boone. Dust devils danced across the parched earth, mimicking the way her thoughts swirled, chaotic and unrestrained. The badge pinned to her chest felt heavier than usual, a leaden weight pressing down on her heart. It was a symbol of order in a town clinging precariously to the edge of chaos, a symbol she'd worn with unwavering pride for the past 10 years. A symbol, she realized with a sickening lurch, that was now a barrier. The jailhouse, a squat, sandstone building, stood baking in the heat. Inside, the air was thick with a scent of stale sweat, dust, and something that pricked at Carrie's senses and stirred a long-dormant unease. It was the scent of Colt Dawson. Leather, gunpowder, and a hint of the wild sage that grew rampant on the outskirts of town. A scent she'd once known intimately, a scent that had haunted her dreams for 15 years. She paused outside his cell, her hand hovering over the iron bars. He was leaning against the back wall, one ankle crossed over the other, arms folded across his chest. Even in confinement, he exuded a raw, untamed energy that made the air crackle. His eyes, the color of a stormy desert sky, met hers, and a slow, knowing smirk played on his lips. The years had etched lines of hardship around his eyes and mouth, but they hadn't diminished the raw, magnetic power he held. He was a blade honed sharp by the harsh realities of the frontier, and that sharpness cut through her composure. "Well, Sheriff," he drawled, his voice rough as gravel. "You gonna keep me in here forever? Or you finally gonna admit you don't want me to leave?" The words, though softly spoken, struck her like a physical blow. They echoed the unspoken truth that had taken root in her heart the moment she'd seen him dragged in, bruised and bloodied, by her deputies. A truth she'd been desperately trying to bury under a mountain of duty and responsibility. "You broke the law, Dawson," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. She forced herself to meet his gaze, to project the unwavering authority expected of her. "You'll stay here until Judge Thompson arrives." His smirk widened, a flash of white teeth against the sun-bronzed skin. "The law? Is that what you're calling it now, Carrie? Seems to me, the law around here bends to whoever's holding the biggest gun, or the deepest grudge." A flush crept up her neck. His words were a blatant challenge, a reminder of the compromises she'd made, the corners she'd cut, to maintain a fragile peace and serenity. He knew her secrets, the shadows that lurked beneath her carefully constructed facade of unwavering righteousness. He'd always known. Carrie turned away from his piercing gaze, her hand gripping the cold iron of the cell door. She needed to regain control, to push down the rising tide of emotions threatening to drown her. "You'll have your day in court," she said, her voice now steadier, though laced with a weariness she couldn't quite conceal. "Until then, you'll stay put." She walked away, her boots echoing on the stone floor, the sound a stark counterpoint to the frantic beat of her heart. The image of Colt behind bars, his eyes burning into her, was seared into her mind. It was a picture that both terrified and exhilarated her. The sheriff's office was a small, cluttered room, dominated by a heavy oak desk piled high with wanted posters, reports, and ledgers. A single window looked out onto the main street of Serenity, offering a panoramic view of the dusty thoroughfare, the weathered storefronts, and the endless expanse of desert beyond. Carrie sank into the worn leather chair behind the desk, the familiar creak a small comfort in the growing storm within her. She rubbed her temples, trying to ease the throbbing headache that had taken root. Colt's presence had ripped open old wounds, wounds she thought she'd long since buried. Wounds inflicted by a youthful love, a reckless passion, and a betrayal that had shattered her world. She remembered him as he was then a young, wild-hearted cowboy, full of laughter and defiance. He'd ridden into her life like a desert storm, sweeping her off her feet with his charm and his reckless disregard for the rules. He was everything her stable, predictable life was not, and she'd fallen for him, hard and fast. Their families, locked in a bitter feud over land and water rights, had forbidden their relationship, adding fuel to the fire of their forbidden love. They'd met in secret, under the vast, star-studded desert sky, sharing stolen kisses and whispered promises. He taught her to ride bareback, to shoot a rifle, to find beauty in the harsh, unforgiving landscape. He'd shown her a world beyond the confines of serenity, a world of freedom and untamed passion. But their idyll had been shattered, violently and irrevocably. A robbery, a shooting, accusations hurled like stones, and Colt, riding away into the night, leaving her behind with a broken heart and a legacy of suspicion. He'd become an outlaw, a legend whispered in hushed tones, while she'd become the sheriff, the enforcer of the law he'd so blatantly defied. Now he was back, a ghost from her past, stirring up the ashes of a love she'd tried so hard to extinguish. And the worst part was, she wasn't sure she wanted those ashes to cool. The feeling was a betrayal of everything she stood for, a betrayal of the badge she wore, a betrayal of the town she'd sworn to protect. But it was there, undeniable and insistent, a burning ember in the cold ashes of her heart. She looked at the wanted poster on her desk, Colt's face staring back at her, hardened and defiant. Wanted, Colt Dawson. For robbery and assault. The words seemed to mock her, to highlight the impossible chasm that separated them. A knock on the door startled her. It was Deputy Thompson, a young, earnest man who'd been with her for the past 5 years. He was loyal and dependable, everything Colt was not. "Sheriff," he said, his brow furrowed with concern, "the townsfolk are getting restless. They've heard about Dawson. They're scared." Carrie sighed. She knew this was coming. Fear was a contagious disease in Serenity, easily spread and difficult to contain. "Tell them I have the situation under control," she said, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "Tell them Dawson will be brought to justice." Deputy Thompson hesitated. "There's something else, Sheriff. Old Man Hemlock, he's stirring up trouble. Saying Dawson's return is a sign of the old feud coming back to life." Old Man Hemlock, the patriarch of the Hemlock family, the Boones' longtime rivals. He was a bitter, vindictive old man, still clinging to the grievances of the past. He'd never forgiven the Boones for winning the water rights dispute, and he'd always blamed Colt for the death of his youngest son, a death that had occurred during the same robbery that had sent Colt fleeing into the desert. Carrie felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Hemlock's involvement was the last thing she needed. It was a spark that could ignite a powder keg of old resentments and simmering hatred. "Keep an eye on him, Thompson," she said, her voice grim. "And make sure word doesn't spread. I don't want this town turning into a battleground." "Yes, Sheriff," Thompson said, and left, closing the door behind him. Carrie was alone again, with the weight of the badge, the burden of her past, and the unsettling presence of Colt Dawson in the cell just down the hall. She looked out the window, at the setting sun painting the desert sky in hues of orange and purple. It was a beautiful, breathtaking sight, but tonight, it offered her no solace. Tonight, the beauty only served to highlight the ugliness that was brewing within her and within the town she'd sworn to protect. The quiet was deceptive. She could feel it, the storm that was coming, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that Colt Dawson was at the center of it. Chapter 2. Shadows of a Shared Past. The kerosene lamp cast long, dancing shadows across the cell, turning the iron bars into skeletal fingers reaching out to clutch at the darkness. Colt watched them, his gaze unfocused, his mind miles away, lost in the labyrinth of his past. He could hear the muffled sounds of Serenity settling down for the night, the distant howl of a coyote, the creak of a sign swinging in the wind, the occasional murmur of voices. Sounds that were both familiar and alien, a reminder of the life he'd left behind, the life he'd been forced to abandon. He shifted his position, the hard cot offering little comfort. The bruises from the fight with Carrie's deputies were starting to ache, a dull throb that mirrored the deeper ache in his heart. He hadn't planned on coming back to serenity. He'd sworn he wouldn't. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. A dying man's confession, a whispered name, a map drawn on a scrap of parchment, it had all led him back here, back to the one place he'd both loved and hated, back to the woman who held the key to his past, and perhaps his future. He closed his eyes, and her image filled his mind.
Carrie.
Even after all these years, the memory of her was vivid, untainted by time and hardship. He remembered the way her dark hair, the color of a raven's wing, would catch the sunlight, the way her eyes, a startling shade of green, would sparkle with laughter or flash with anger. He remembered the feel of her hand in his, the warmth of her body pressed against his, the scent of her skin, like wildflowers after a desert rain. He'd loved her with a fierceness that had bordered on obsession, a love that had defied logic and reason. He'd been a reckless, headstrong young man, convinced he could conquer the world, and she'd been his anchor, his guiding star. He believed their love was strong enough to overcome anything, even the bitter feud that divided their families. He'd been wrong. The memory of that night, the night it all fell apart, still haunted him. The chaos, the shouting, the gunshots, the accusing eyes of the townsfolk, the look of betrayal on Carrie's face. He'd tried to explain, to tell her the truth, but she hadn't believed him. Or perhaps she hadn't wanted to believe him. He'd ridden away, leaving her standing there, silhouetted against the flickering light of the burning barn, a scene forever etched in his memory. He'd become an outlaw, a shadow, living on the fringes of society, his name synonymous with trouble. He'd carried the weight of his past like a shroud, the guilt and the regret gnawing at him. He hadn't seen her again until today. Seeing her, wearing the sheriff's badge, her expression hardened by years of responsibility, had been a shock to his system. It was like seeing a ghost, a familiar face superimposed on a stranger. The girl he'd loved was still there, buried beneath layers of duty and disillusionment, but she was different. Stronger, perhaps, but also more guarded, more wary. And yet, when their eyes had met, he'd seen a flicker of something else in those green depths. A spark of recognition, a hint of the old connection that had once bound them together. It was that spark that had given him hope, a fragile, flickering flame in the darkness of his despair. He heard the sound of footsteps approaching, the jangle of keys. He opened his eyes and saw Carrie standing outside his cell, her face obscured by the shadows. She held a tray in her hands, the smell of coffee and fried bacon wafting towards him. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, her voice low and even. She unlocked the cell door and stepped inside, placing the tray on the small, rickety table. The close proximity sent a jolt of awareness through him, a reminder of the physical pull that still existed between them, despite everything. "Thanks," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She didn't reply, just stood there, watching him. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, unacknowledged emotions. "Why did you come back, Colt?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his gaze searching hers. He could lie, he could tell her what she wanted to hear, but he wouldn't. Not this time. "I came back for the truth," he said, his voice low and steady. "The truth about what happened that night. The truth about who set me up." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak. "I didn't rob that stagecoach, Carrie," he continued, his voice laced with a quiet intensity. "And I didn't shoot anyone. I was framed." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the tray of food. "That's what you said 15 years ago," she said, her voice flat. "And you didn't believe me then," he said, a hint of bitterness creeping into his tone. She turned back to him, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and pain. "How could I believe you? Everyone saw you. You were there, Colt. You ran." "I ran because I had no choice," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I was being hunted, Carrie. By the Hemlocks, by the law, by everyone. And you expect me to believe that now? She asked, her voice laced with skepticism. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He knew he had to earn her trust, a trust he'd broken 15 years ago. I have proof, he said, his voice quieter now. A deathbed confession. A map. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. A map? To what? To the real stolen goods, he said. And to the man who orchestrated the whole thing. A long silence followed, broken only by the crackling of the kerosene lamp. Carrie stared at him, her eyes searching his, trying to discern the truth from the lies, the reality from the shadows of their shared past. He could see the doubt warring with the hope in her eyes, the conflict between the sheriff and the woman, the law and the heart. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Show me. It was a small concession, a fragile thread of trust, but it was enough. It was a start. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, worn and creased with age. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers, sending a jolt of electricity through him. She unfolded the map, her eyes scanning the crude drawing, the faded ink. He watched her, his heart pounding in his chest, his future hanging in the balance. The map was his only chance at redemption, his only hope of clearing his name, and perhaps of rekindling the flame that had once burned so brightly between them. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until she finally looked up, her expression a mixture of disbelief and something else. Something that looked a lot like hope. The air shifted, a subtle change, but he felt it. The burden, though still heavy, felt a fraction lighter. He'd taken the first step. Chapter 3. A cage of iron and regret. The map lay spread out on Carrie's desk, the flickering lamplight illuminating the crude lines and faded ink. It depicted a series of landmarks, a twisted juniper tree, a rock formation shaped like a skull, a dry creek bed, all familiar features of the rugged landscape surrounding Serenity. Colt's finger traced a path, stopping at a small X marked near a cluster of hills known as the Devil's Spine. That's where they hid the strongbox, he said, his voice low and resonant in the quiet office. And according to Silas, the man who confessed, the name of the man behind it all is written on the back of a silver locket hidden with the money. Carrie leaned closer, her brow furrowed in concentration. Silas. The name stirred a vague memory, a face from the periphery of her past. A drifter, a gambler, a man who'd been in and out of Serenity's jail more times than she could count. He died a week ago, in a dusty saloon in Tucson, riddled with bullets after a card game gone wrong. But not before whispering Colt's name and a few cryptic words to a passing stranger, words that had somehow found their way back to Colt. Silas was working with someone in Serenity, she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Someone who framed you? Colt nodded, his jaw tight. Someone who wanted me out of the way. Someone who profited from the robbery. The implications of his words were staggering. If Colt was telling the truth, it meant that a respected member of the Serenity community was a criminal, a liar, and possibly a murderer. It meant that the foundation of her town, the very principles she'd sworn to uphold, were built on a lie. She looked at Colt, his face etched with years of hardship and regret. The lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights, of battles fought and lost. The scar above his left eyebrow, a memento from a bar fight in some forgotten town, stood out starkly against his sun-bronzed skin. He looked like a man who'd been to hell and back, a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. And yet, despite the hardened exterior, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a glimpse of the young, passionate man she'd once loved. A man who had been betrayed, not only by a supposed friend, but by the woman he'd trusted. The thought sent a pang of guilt through her, a sharp reminder of her own role in his downfall. Why didn't you tell me this before? She asked, her voice softer now, the anger replaced by a weary sadness. Why didn't you fight harder to prove your innocence? He met her gaze, his eyes dark and intense. I tried, Carrie. But you wouldn't listen. Nobody would. I was a Dawson, you were a Boone. The feud was too deep, the accusations too convenient. His words were like a punch to the gut.
He was right.
The feud between their families had been a festering wound, poisoning everything it touched. She'd been blinded by her own sense of righteousness, by her loyalty to her family, by her fear of the truth. I was young, she said, her voice faltering. And I was afraid. Afraid of what? He asked, his voice a low rumble. Afraid of loving an outlaw? Afraid of going against your family? She couldn't meet his gaze. He was hitting too close to home, exposing the raw, vulnerable core she'd kept hidden for so long. Afraid of everything, she whispered, her voice barely audible. A long silence filled the room, broken only by the crackling of the lamp and the distant sounds of the night. Carrie felt a tear slip down her cheek, a tear she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years. It was a tear of regret, of sorrow, of a lost love and a shattered dream. Colt reached out, his hand hovering over hers, his touch hesitant, as if unsure of his welcome. She didn't pull away. The warmth of his skin, the callous strength of his fingers, sent a shiver through her, a reminder of the physical connection that had once been so powerful, so undeniable. I never stopped loving you, Carrie, he said, his voice husky with emotion. Even when I hated you for not believing me, I never stopped loving you. His words were like a balm to her wounded soul, a soothing whisper in the storm that raged within her. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his, and saw a reflection of her own pain, her own longing. The years melted away, and for a moment, they were just two young people, caught in the crosscurrents of a forbidden love. But the moment was fleeting. The reality of their situation, the weight of their past, came crashing back down on them. She was the sheriff, he was the outlaw. The lines were drawn, the boundaries clearly defined. She pulled her hand away, breaking the fragile connection. That was a long time ago, Colt, she said, her voice regaining its composure, though a tremor remained. We're different people now. Are we? He asked, his eyes searching hers. Or are we just pretending to be? She didn't answer. She couldn't. The truth was too dangerous, too painful to acknowledge. I need to verify this, she said, her voice turning professional again, the sheriff masking the woman. I need to see if this map is real, if this confession holds any weight. I understand, he said, his voice resigned. But I'm telling you, Carrie, I'm innocent. And I'm going to prove it, with or without your help. His words were a challenge, a promise, and a plea, all rolled into one. She knew he meant them. He was a man driven by a fierce sense of justice, a man who wouldn't rest until he'd cleared his name. I'll keep you locked up, she said, her voice firm, though her heart ached at the words. For your own safety, and for the safety of the town. He nodded, his expression grim. He knew the risks. He knew that old man Hemlock and his sons would be gunning for him, eager to avenge the death of their kin, regardless of the truth. But, she continued, her voice softening slightly, I'll look into it. I'll follow the map. I'll see where it leads. It was a small concession, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. But it was enough. It was a sign that she was starting to question, to doubt, to consider the possibility that she'd been wrong. Thank you, Carrie, he said, his voice sincere. That's all I ask. She locked him back in his cell, the clang of the iron door echoing in the silence. She returned to her office, the map still spread out on her desk, a tangible symbol of the tangled web of secrets and lies that had ensnared them both. As she stared at the map, a new feeling began to stir within her. Not just doubt, but a flicker of determination. A determination to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. A determination to right the wrongs of the past, not just for Colt, but for herself. The cage of iron held Colt, but she was starting to realize a cage of regret had, for all of these years, confined her. And she knew that finding the truth held on that map was the only key. The wind picked up outside, whispering through the cracks in the walls, a mournful sound that echoed the turmoil in her heart. Chapter 4. The Outlaw's Plea. The morning dawned gray and overcast, the sun struggling to break through the thick layer of clouds. The air was heavy with the threat of rain, a mirror of the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over Serenity. Carrie stood on the porch of the jailhouse, sipping her coffee, the bitter taste doing little to dispel the lingering unease that had clung to her since the previous night. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying her conversation with Colt, dissecting his words, searching for any hint of deception. The map was still etched in her memory, the landmarks eerily familiar. She'd spent hours poring over old town records, searching for any mention of Silas, any clue that might corroborate Colt's story. She'd found nothing concrete, but the seeds of doubt had been firmly planted, growing stronger with each passing hour. She watched as Deputy Thompson approached, his young face etched with worry. "Morning, Sheriff," he said, his voice subdued. "Town's quiet." "Too quiet." Carrie nodded, her gaze sweeping the deserted main street. The usual morning bustle was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. The saloon doors were closed, the general store was shuttered, and the few people she saw scurried along with their heads down, avoiding eye contact. "They're afraid," she said, her voice a low murmur. "They're waiting to see what happens." "Hemlock's been spreading rumors," Thompson said, his voice grim. "Saying Dawson's back for revenge. Saying it's the start of another war." Carrie sighed. Old Man Hemlock was like a persistent weed, constantly popping up, spreading his poison. She needed to deal with him, and soon, before his words ignited a fire she couldn't control. "I'll talk to him," she said, her voice firm. "But first I need to check something." She handed Thompson her coffee cup and walked back inside the jailhouse. The air was cool and damp, the scent of Colt's presence still lingering in the air. She paused outside his cell, her heart beating a little faster. He was sitting on the cot, his back against the wall, his eyes closed. He looked vulnerable, a stark contrast to the defiant outlaw she'd faced yesterday. She cleared her throat, and his eyes snapped open. "Morning, Sheriff," he said, his voice raspy from sleep. "I'm going to follow the map," she said, her voice direct, cutting to the chase. "I'm going to see if it leads where you say it does." His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You believe me?" "I don't know what to believe," she said honestly. "But I owe it to myself, and to this town, to find out the truth." He nodded, his expression serious. "Be careful, Carrie. Whoever framed me is still out there. And they won't hesitate to silence anyone who gets in their way." His words sent a chill down her spine. She knew he was right. The stakes were high, and the danger was real. "I can handle myself," she said, her voice regaining its confidence, though a tremor of fear remained. "I know you can," he said, his gaze holding hers. "But that doesn't mean I won't worry." His words, spoken softly, sent a warmth through her, a feeling she hadn't expected. It was a reminder of the connection they'd once shared, a connection that seemed to be re-emerging, despite the years and the circumstances. "I'll be back before nightfall," she said, turning away from his intense gaze. "Thompson will be here. Don't try anything stupid." "Wouldn't dream of it, Sheriff," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. She left the jailhouse, feeling a mixture of trepidation and determination. She saddled her horse, a sturdy mare named Belle, and rode out of town, following the familiar trail that led towards the Devil's Spine. The landscape was stark and unforgiving, a tapestry of red rock canyons, towering mesas, and sprawling desert scrub. The silence was broken only by the sound of Belle's hooves on the dusty ground and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. As she rode, Carrie's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle of Colt's past. She thought about the robbery, the accusations, the evidence that had seemed so irrefutable at the time. She remembered the look of shock and betrayal on her father's face, the anger in her brother's eyes. She remembered her own grief, her own sense of loss. But now, she was starting to see things differently. She was starting to question the narrative she'd accepted for so long. She was starting to wonder if she'd been too quick to judge, too eager to believe the worst. She reached the first landmark on the map, the twisted juniper tree. It stood gnarled and weathered, a silent sentinel on the edge of a deep ravine. She dismounted, her hand resting on the butt of her revolver, her senses on high alert. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. She followed the map's instructions, pacing out the distance to the next landmark, the rock formation shaped like a skull. It loomed ahead of her, a grim reminder of the dangers that lurked in this desolate landscape. As she approached the rock formation, she heard a sound of faint rustling in the dry brush. She froze, her hand tightening on her revolver. She scanned the surrounding area, her eyes searching for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind a large boulder, a rifle leveled at her. It was Jed Hemlock, Old Man Hemlock's eldest son, his face contorted with hatred. Well, he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Look what we have here. The sheriff, all alone and unprotected. Come to join your outlaw lover, have you? Carrie stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest, but her voice remained steady. Put the gun down, Jed, she said, her voice calm but firm. This doesn't have to end badly. It ends badly for you, Sheriff, he said, his finger tightening on the trigger. And for that murdering scum, Dawson. Carrie knew she was in a precarious situation. Jed was a hothead, fueled by years of resentment and a thirst for revenge. He was unpredictable, dangerous. She had to find a way to de-escalate the situation, to buy herself some time. Jed, she said, her voice softer now, trying to appeal to any shred of reason that might remain. Colt is innocent. He was framed. I'm trying to find the truth. The truth? He scoffed. The truth is, he killed my brother. And he's gonna pay for it. He raised the rifle, his eyes narrowed, his intention clear. Carrie knew she had only seconds to react. She drew her revolver, the movement swift and practiced, and fired. The shot echoed through the canyon, a deafening roar in the stillness of the desert. Jed stumbled backward, the rifle falling from his grasp, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He clutched at his arm, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. He hadn't been fatally wounded, but he was disarmed. The threat, for the moment, was neutralized. But she knew, with a sinking feeling, that this was just the beginning. The shot would have alerted anyone nearby, and the real culprit was still out there, somewhere, hidden in the shadows. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Desert Wind. The echo of the gunshot died away, swallowed by the vastness of the canyon. Carrie kept her revolver trained on Jed, who was groaning and clutching his wounded arm. The air was thick with tension, the silence punctuated by the labored breathing of the injured man and the frantic beat of Carrie's own heart. Stay down, she commanded, her voice sharp and unwavering. Don't make me shoot you again. Jed glared at her, his eyes filled with hatred, but he made no move to get up. He knew he was at her mercy, and for the moment, that was enough. Carrie holstered her revolver and quickly retrieved Jed's rifle, tossing it out of his reach. She then knelt beside him, her movements cautious but efficient. She tore a strip of cloth from her shirt and used it to bind his wound, stopping the bleeding. Why, Carrie? He gasped, his voice laced with pain and resentment. Why are you protecting him? He's a killer. I'm not protecting him, she said, her voice firm. I'm upholding the law. And the law says he's innocent until proven guilty. The law? He scoffed. The law is a joke. Your pa bought and paid for the law in this town. Carrie ignored his accusation, focusing on securing the makeshift bandage. She knew the Hemlocks had always resented her family, believing they'd used their wealth and influence to control Serenity. It was a resentment that had festered for generations, fueled by envy and a thirst for revenge. I'm taking you back to town, she said, standing up and pulling Jed to his feet. You'll be treated for your wound, and then you'll be locked up. You'll regret this, Sheriff, he snarled. My pa won't let this stand. He'll make you pay. Carrie didn't reply. She knew Old Man Hemlock would be furious, that he'd see this as an act of war. But she couldn't let fear dictate her actions. She had to follow the truth, no matter where it led. She forced Jed to walk ahead of her, his hands bound with his own belt, back towards where she'd left Belle. The journey was slow and arduous, the injured man stumbling and complaining every step of the way. As they walked, Carrie's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Jed's attack had confirmed her suspicion someone was actively trying to prevent her from finding the truth. Someone who was afraid of what she might uncover. But who?
And why?
The map was the key. It held the answer. She was sure of it. She had to get back to it, to continue her search. They reached Bell, and Carrie helped Jed onto the horse, mounting behind him. She kept a firm grip on the reins, her senses on high alert, watching for any sign of further trouble. As they rode back towards Serenity, the wind picked up, whipping around them, carrying with it the whispers of the desert. The sound was eerie, almost mournful, as if the land itself was lamenting the secrets it held, the betrayals it had witnessed. Carrie thought about Colt, locked up in the jailhouse, waiting for her return. She thought about the look in his eyes, the mixture of hope and apprehension. She realized, with a start, that she was starting to care about him again, that the old feelings were stirring, despite her best efforts to suppress them. It was a dangerous realization, a complication she didn't need. But she couldn't deny it. The connection between them was still there, a fragile thread woven through the years of separation and mistrust. As they approached Serenity, Carrie saw a group of people gathered in front of the jailhouse. She recognized Old Man Hemlock, his face a mask of fury, surrounded by his other sons and a handful of loyal followers. They were armed and angry, a volatile mob ready to explode. Carrie felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. This was exactly what she'd feared. A confrontation, a showdown. She had to find a way to defuse the situation, to prevent bloodshed. She rode into the midst of the crowd, her hand resting on the butt of her revolver, her expression calm but resolute. "What's the meaning of this, Hemlock?" she demanded, her voice ringing out across the square. Old Man Hemlock stepped forward, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You shot my boy, Sheriff," he snarled. "You attacked him, unprovoked. You're protecting a killer." "Your son attacked me," Carrie said, her voice steady. "He tried to kill me. I acted in self-defense."
"Lies,"
Hemlock shouted. "You're in league with Dawson. You're helping him escape." "I'm upholding the law," Carrie said, her voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "Dawson is in jail, awaiting trial. Your son is injured, but he'll live. He'll be treated, and then he'll face justice for his actions." "Justice?" Hemlock scoffed. "There's no justice in this town. Only Boone justice." He turned to the crowd, his voice rising to a fever pitch. "Are we gonna let this stand? Are we gonna let the Boones run roughshod over us again? Are we gonna let them protect a killer?" The crowd roared its approval, their anger fueled by Hemlock's words. They surged forward, their faces contorted with rage, their weapons raised. Carrie knew she was in a desperate situation. She was outnumbered, outgunned. She had to find a way to calm them down, to prevent a bloodbath. She looked at the faces in the crowd, searching for any sign of reason, any flicker of humanity. She saw fear, anger, resentment, but she also saw doubt, uncertainty. Not everyone was convinced by Hemlock's rhetoric. She took a deep breath, her voice clear and strong. "Listen to me," she shouted. "I know there's bad blood between our families. I know there's a history of pain and mistrust. But we can't let the past dictate the future. We can't let violence rule this town." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "I'm following a lead," she said, choosing the next part carefully. "A lead that might prove Colt Dawson's innocence. A lead that might reveal the truth about what happened 15 years ago." Her words had an effect. The crowd's roar subsided, replaced by a murmur of curiosity. They were listening, at least for now. "I'm asking you," she said, her voice pleading, "to give me a chance. Give me time to find the truth. Let the law prevail, not violence." The silence stretched, heavy and tense. Carrie held her breath, waiting for their reaction. The whispers of the desert wind seemed to amplify the moment, the uncertainty, the precarious balance between peace and chaos. The fate of Serenity, and perhaps her own, hung in the balance. Chapter 6. The Price of Loyalty. The crowd remained frozen, a tableau of anger and uncertainty. The wind whipped around them, stirring up dust and debris, mirroring the turmoil that raged within each individual. Old Man Hemlock glared at Carrie, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred, but he didn't speak. He was waiting, watching, assessing the mood of the crowd. Carrie held her ground, her gaze unwavering, her hand still resting on the butt of her revolver. She knew she'd planted a seed of doubt, but it was a fragile seed, easily crushed by the weight of years of resentment and mistrust. Finally, a voice broke the silence. It was Martha Jenkins, the owner of the general store, a woman known for her level-headedness and her sense of fairness. "Let her speak, Hemlock," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Let her finish what she started." Other voices joined in, murmurs of agreement rippling through the crowd. "She's always been fair," someone said. "Give her a chance," another added. The tide was turning, slowly but surely. The anger was still there, but it was tempered by curiosity, by a flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the truth might finally be revealed. Old Man Hemlock saw the shift in the crowd's mood and realized he was losing control. He scowled, his face contorted with frustration, but he knew he couldn't go against the will of the majority. "All right, Sheriff," he said, his voice grudging. "You've got until sundown tomorrow. If you haven't found this proof by then, we'll take matters into our own hands." It was a threat, thinly veiled, but it was also a concession. He'd given her a reprieve, a chance to prove her claims. "Thank you," Carrie said, her voice calm, though her heart was racing. "I won't disappoint you." She turned to Deputy Thompson, who had been standing silently by her side, his face pale with anxiety. "Take Jed to Doc Miller," she said. "Make sure he's treated, and then lock him up. And keep an eye on Hemlock and his sons. I don't want any more trouble." "Yes, Sheriff," Thompson said, his voice relieved. Carrie dismounted, her legs feeling a little shaky. She handed Belle's reins to a young boy who'd been watching the scene with wide eyes, and walked towards the jailhouse, the crowd parting to let her pass. She entered the jailhouse, the cool air a welcome relief from the tension outside. Colt was standing by the bars of his cell, his face etched with concern. "What happened?" he asked, his voice urgent. "I heard the shouting." Carrie told him about her encounter with Jed, about the confrontation with Old Man Hemlock and the crowd. She explained the ultimatum she'd been given sundown tomorrow to find the proof of his innocence. Colt listened intently, his expression grim. "They're desperate," he said. "They know you're getting close. But who are they?" Carrie asked, her voice frustrated. "Who framed you, Colt? Who's behind all this?" He shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "But the answer is on that map, Carrie. You have to find it." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and fear.
She knew he was right.
The map was their only hope. "I'll go back," she said. "I'll finish what I started." "Be careful," he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a warmth that sent a shiver through her. "I don't want to lose you again." His words, spoken with such sincerity, touched her deeply. She realized, with a start, that she didn't want to lose him either. She nodded, unable to speak, and turned to leave. She needed to get back to the Devil's Spine, to follow the map to its final destination. But before she did, she needed to do one more thing. She went to her office and retrieved a small, locked box from under her desk. It contained her most precious possessions, a few letters, a faded photograph of her parents, and a silver locket. The locket had been her mother's. It was a delicate piece of jewelry, intricately engraved with a floral design. Carrie had always loved it, but she'd never known its true significance. She opened the locket, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside, there were 2 miniature portraits, one of her mother, young and beautiful, and one of her father, handsome and proud. But there was something else, hidden behind the portraits, a small, folded piece of paper. Carrie carefully unfolded the paper, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a letter, written in her mother's elegant handwriting. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. "My dearest Caroline," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have discovered the truth about your father. I know this will be difficult for you, but you must be strong. You must know the truth, no matter how painful it may be." Carrie's breath caught in her throat. Her father? What did her father have to do with any of this? She continued reading, her eyes scanning the words, her mind reeling. The letter revealed a secret that had been buried for years, a secret that would change everything. It revealed that her father had not always been the upstanding citizen he appeared to be. He'd had a past, a dark secret that he'd kept hidden from everyone, even his own wife. The letter implicated her father in the stagecoach robbery, in the framing of Colt Dawson. It explained that he'd been in debt to Old Man Hemlock and that he'd agreed to help him steal the money in exchange for clearing his debts. He'd used Colt as a scapegoat, knowing that the feud between their families would make him an easy target. Carrie felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her father? A criminal? A liar? It was impossible. Unthinkable. But the evidence was there, in her mother's own handwriting. The locket, the letter, it all fit. She sank into her chair, her mind reeling, her world crumbling around her. The man she'd admired, the man she'd trusted, had been a fraud. And she'd been living a lie. The price of loyalty to her family name had been steep. It had cost Colt his freedom, and her happiness. And now it was threatening to cost her everything. The desert wind howled outside, a mournful cry that echoed the devastation in her heart. Chapter 7. Scars Beneath the Surface. The revelation hit Carrie like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and reeling. The office, once a sanctuary of order and control, now felt like a suffocating cage. Her father's portrait, hanging on the wall opposite her desk, seemed to mock her, his painted smile a cruel reminder of the deception he'd perpetrated. She reread the letter, her fingers trembling, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of the betrayal. Her mother had discovered the truth shortly before her death, a truth that had apparently hastened her demise. She'd left the letter in the locket, hoping that Carrie would one day find it and expose the truth. But why hadn't her mother told her sooner? Why had she kept the secret for so long? Carrie realized, with a pang of guilt, that her mother had probably been protecting her, shielding her from the painful truth. She'd also likely been afraid of her husband, afraid of what he might do if she exposed him. The weight of her family's legacy, the burden of their secrets, pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. She felt betrayed, not only by her father, but by her own naivete, by her blind faith in the man she'd thought she knew. She looked at the map, still lying on her desk, the X marking the spot where the stolen strongbox was supposedly hidden. It was no longer just about clearing Colt's name, it was about uncovering the truth about her own family, about exposing the rot that had festered beneath the surface of Serenity for so long. She knew what she had to do. She had to follow the map, to find the strongbox, to find the evidence that would confirm her father's guilt and, hopefully, reveal the identity of the other conspirators. But she also knew that she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, someone she could trust. She thought of Deputy Thompson, loyal and dependable, but young and inexperienced. He wouldn't be able to handle the danger, the potential for violence. She thought of the townsfolk, but they were divided, their loyalties uncertain. She couldn't risk exposing her suspicions to the wrong person. There was only one person she could turn to: Colt. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. The man she'd once condemned, the man she believed to be a criminal, was now her only hope. She went to his cell, her heart pounding in her chest. He was sitting on the cot, his gaze fixed on the floor, his expression grim. "Colt," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that looked a lot like hope. "I know who framed you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I know why." She told him about the letter, about her father's involvement in the robbery, about the debt to Old Man Hemlock. She explained everything, holding nothing back. Colt listened intently, his expression changing from disbelief to anger to a grim satisfaction. He'd known he was innocent, but he hadn't known the full extent of the conspiracy against him. "Your father," he said, his voice low and laced with bitterness. "The man who swore to uphold the law." "I know," Carrie said, her voice choked with emotion. I am so sorry, Colt. He reached out, his hand covering hers through the bars of the cell. It's not your fault, Carrie, he said, his voice gentle. You didn't know. His touch sent a warmth through her, a feeling of comfort and reassurance. She realized, with a start, that she was no longer alone. She had an ally, a partner, someone who understood her pain, her confusion. I need your help, she said, her voice gaining strength. I need to find that strongbox. I need to find the proof. I'm with you, Carrie, he said, his voice firm. Always. His words, spoken with such conviction, gave her courage. She knew she was facing a dangerous task, but she wasn't afraid. She had Colt by her side, and together, they would uncover the truth. She unlocked his cell, the clang of the iron door echoing in the silence. It was a symbolic act, a release not only from physical confinement, but from the emotional prison she'd been trapped in for so long. Let's go, she said, her voice determined. They left the jailhouse, stepping out into the fading light of the late afternoon. The town was quiet, the streets deserted. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the storm to break. They saddled their horses and rode out of town, following the familiar trail towards the Devil's Spine. The landscape was bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, a beautiful but deceptive scene. As they rode, Carrie thought about the scars beneath the surface, the hidden wounds that festered beneath the veneer of respectability. She thought about her father, about Colt, about herself. They were all carrying scars, visible and invisible, reminders of the pain they'd endured, the battles they'd fought. The desert stretched before them, vast and unforgiving. The setting sun had painted the sky with fire and shadows. The scars of the past were deep, but as she rode beside Colt, she began to think they weren't insurmountable. Perhaps, together, they could find healing. Chapter 8. A Storm Brewing. The ride to the Devil's Spine was tense and silent. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the rugged landscape, making the familiar terrain seem alien and menacing. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence broken only by the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves and the occasional rustle of the wind through the dry brush. Carrie kept glancing at Colt, riding beside her, his face grim and determined. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hand rested on the butt of his revolver. He was ready for anything, prepared to face whatever dangers lay ahead. She admired his strength, his resilience. He'd been through so much, endured so much injustice, yet he hadn't given up. He was still fighting, still striving for redemption. She realized, with a growing sense of conviction, that she was fighting alongside him, not just for his sake, but for her own. She was fighting for the truth, for justice, for a future free from the lies and deceit of the past. They reached the twisted juniper tree, the first landmark on the map. The sky was now ablaze with color, the last rays of the sun painting the clouds in hues of orange, red, and purple. It was a breathtaking sight, but Carrie couldn't appreciate it. Her mind was focused on the task ahead, on the dangers that lurked in the shadows. They dismounted, their movements cautious and deliberate. Colt checked his revolver, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. Carrie did the same, her senses on high alert. Stay close, Colt said, his voice low and urgent. And be ready for anything. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew he was right. They were walking into a trap, a carefully laid snare set by someone who wanted them dead. They followed the map's instructions, pacing out the distance to the rock formation shaped like a skull. It loomed ahead of them, a grim sentinel guarding the secrets hidden within the canyon. As they approached the rock formation, they heard a sound, the faint click of a hammer being cocked. They froze, their bodies tensing, their hands reaching for their weapons. Suddenly, figures emerged from behind the rocks, rifles and shotguns leveled at them. It was Old Man Hemlock and his sons, their faces contorted with hatred and rage. Well, Hemlock sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Look who's come crawling back. The outlaw and his whore. Carrie felt a surge of anger at his words, but She kept her voice calm and controlled. "We're here for the truth, Hemlock," she said. "We're here to find the evidence that will clear Colt's name." "The only evidence you'll find is a bullet in your head," Hemlock snarled. "You should have stayed away, Sheriff. You should have let sleeping dogs lie." "It's time to wake them up," Colt said, his voice cold and hard. "It's time for the truth to come out." "The truth?" Hemlock scoffed. "The truth is, you're a killer, Dawson. And you're gonna pay for what you did." He raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Carrie and Colt reacted instantly, drawing their revolvers and firing. The canyon erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, the sound echoing off the rock walls. Bullets whizzed past them, kicking up dust and debris. Carrie and Colt took cover behind a large boulder, returning fire, their shots precise and deadly. The Hemlocks were outnumbered, but they were determined, fueled by years of hatred and a thirst for revenge. They fought fiercely, their shots relentless and unforgiving. Carrie felt a bullet graze her arm, a searing pain that made her gasp. She pressed her hand against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. "Carrie," Colt shouted, his voice filled with concern. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, her voice strained. "Just a scratch." She knew she couldn't afford to be weak. She had to keep fighting, not only for herself, but for Colt, for the truth. They continued to exchange fire, the battle raging back and forth. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the acrid scent of fear. One of Hemlock's sons fell, clutching his chest, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. Another was wounded, his arm hanging limp and useless. But the Hemlocks kept coming, their numbers dwindling, but their determination unwavering. Carrie realized, with a sinking feeling, that they were trapped. They were surrounded, outgunned, and running out of ammunition. She looked at Colt, his face grim and determined, his eyes filled with a fierce resolve. She knew he wouldn't give up, even if it meant facing certain death. And she knew, with a sudden clarity, that she wouldn't either. She'd come too far, risked too much, to surrender now. She took a deep breath, her hand tightening on her revolver. "We have to make a run for it," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We have to get to the strongbox." Colt nodded, his eyes meeting hers. He knew it was a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. They waited for a lull in the firing, and then, on a silent count, they sprang from behind the boulder, running towards the spot marked on the map, their revolvers blazing. The Hemlocks opened fire, their bullets raining down on them. Carrie felt a sharp pain in her leg, but she kept running, her adrenaline pumping, her focus unwavering. They reached the spot, a small crevice hidden behind a cluster of rocks. Colt frantically began digging, his hands clawing at the earth, his movements desperate and urgent. Carrie kept watch, her revolver trained on the approaching Hemlocks, her finger on the trigger, ready to defend their position to the death. The storm that had been brewing all day was finally breaking. Not just the metaphorical one, between families and pasts, but a real one, with thunder cracking overhead and lightning illuminating the desperate scene in stark, fleeting flashes. Chapter 9. Renegade Hearts. The wind howled like a banshee, whipping around them, tearing at their clothes and stinging their faces with sand and grit. The thunder cracked overhead, the sound deafening, and lightning illuminated the canyon in brief, stark flashes, revealing the desperate scene in all its brutal detail. Colt dug frantically, his hands bleeding, his muscles straining. He could feel the strongbox beneath his fingers, the cold metal a tangible symbol of hope and redemption. Carrie stood guard, her revolver blazing, her shots finding their mark, slowing the Hemlock's advance. She was wounded, bleeding, but she fought with a ferocity born of desperation and a fierce determination to protect Colt, to protect the truth. "I've got it!" Colt shouted, his voice hoarse with exertion. He heaved the strongbox out of the ground, the metal scarred and rusted, but intact. He ripped open the lid, his hands trembling with anticipation. Inside, there were stacks of money, bundles of cash tied with faded string. But there was something else, Nestled among the bills a small, silver locket. Colt grabbed the locket, his heart pounding in his chest. He opened it, his fingers fumbling with the delicate clasp. Inside, there were no miniature portraits, just a folded piece of paper. He unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the words, his breath catching in his throat. It was a confession, written in a shaky hand, implicating not only Carrie's father, but also Old Man Hemlock. The confession revealed that Hemlock had orchestrated the entire robbery, using Carrie's father as a pawn, promising to clear his debts in exchange for his cooperation. He'd planned to frame Colt from the beginning, knowing that the feud between their families would make him an easy target. Carrie lowered her revolver, her arm aching, her body exhausted. She looked at Colt, his face illuminated by a flash of lightning, his eyes filled with a mixture of triumph and disbelief. "Hemlock," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He was behind it all along. The realization hit Carrie with the force of a physical blow. Hemlock, the man who'd pretended to be a victim, the man who'd fueled the feud for years, had been the mastermind behind it all. Suddenly, a shot rang out, and Colt gasped, clutching his shoulder. He stumbled backward, the locket falling from his grasp. Carrie spun around, her revolver raised, and saw Old Man Hemlock standing a few feet away, a smoking rifle in his hands. His face was contorted with rage, his eyes blazing with madness. "You'll never get away with this," he snarled. "I'll kill you both before I let you expose me." He raised the rifle again, aiming at Carrie. But before he could fire, another shot rang out, and Hemlock staggered backward, clutching his chest. He fell to the ground, the rifle slipping from his grasp, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Carrie lowered her revolver, her hand trembling. She hadn't fired the shot. She looked around, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw Deputy Thompson standing at the edge of the canyon, his rifle still smoking. Thompson had followed her, tracking them through the storm, arriving just in time to save their lives. He'd heard the gunshots, seen the battle, and realized what was happening. He rushed towards them, his face pale with concern. "Sheriff, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Carrie said, her voice shaky. "But Colt, he's been shot." Thompson knelt beside Colt, examining his wound. "It's not life-threatening," he said, his voice relieved. "But we need to get him to a doctor." They helped Colt to his feet, supporting him between them. The storm was starting to subside, the wind dying down, the thunder fading away. The sky was still overcast, but the worst was over. As they made their way back to their horses, Carrie picked up the locket, the silver gleaming in the faint light. It was a symbol of the truth, a testament to the lies and deceit that had poisoned Serenity for so long. She looked at Colt, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes filled with a quiet strength. He'd been through so much, endured so much pain, but he'd finally found redemption. And she, too, had found something. She'd found the truth, she'd found justice, and she'd found a love that had endured the test of time, a love that had been forged in the fires of adversity. They were renegade hearts, bound together by a shared past, a shared struggle, and a shared hope for a future free from the shadows of deceit. As they rode back towards Serenity, Carrie clutched the locket. It was proof of the past, but the real prize was ahead. Colt. Chapter 10. The Unforgiving Land. The journey back to Serenity was slow and arduous. Colt, weakened by blood loss and pain, leaned heavily on Carrie, his arms slung around her shoulders. Deputy Thompson rode alongside, his rifle at the ready, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a trail of destruction. The desert, usually dry and barren, was now awash with water, the dry creek beds transformed into raging torrents. The air was cool and damp, the scent of wet earth and sage filling their lungs. Carrie was exhausted, her body aching, her wounds throbbing. But she kept going, fueled by adrenaline and a fierce determination to get Colt to safety. She knew that Doc Miller was the only one who could help him, the only one who could tend to his wound and ensure his survival. She thought about the events of the past few hours, the battle in the canyon, the revelation of Hemlock's treachery, the near-death experiences. It had all happened so fast, a whirlwind of violence and emotion that had left her reeling. But amidst the chaos and the danger, she'd found a clarity, a sense of purpose. She'd faced her fears, she'd confronted her past, and she'd emerged stronger, more resilient. And she'd found something else, something she'd thought she'd lost forever. She'd found love, a love that had been tested by time and adversity, a love that had survived the storms of betrayal and mistrust. She looked at Colt, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes still filled with that quiet strength that had drawn her to him so many years ago. He was a survivor, a fighter, a man who wouldn't give up, no matter the odds. And she was a survivor too. She'd endured the loss of her parents, the betrayal of her father, the weight of her family's legacy. She'd carried the burden of responsibility, the pressure of upholding the law in a town torn apart by feuds and secrets. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had Colt, and she had the truth. And together, they would rebuild, they would heal, they would create a new future for Serenity, a future free from the lies and deceit of the past. As they approached the outskirts of town, they saw a group of people waiting for them, their faces anxious and uncertain. They were the townsfolk, the people of Serenity, who had witnessed the storm, heard the gunshots, and feared the worst. They had gathered to see the outcome, to learn the fate of their sheriff, of the outlaw, of their town. Carrie rode into the midst of the crowd, her head held high, her expression calm but resolute. She dismounted, her legs feeling a little shaky, and helped Colt down from his horse. "It's over," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing out across the square. "The truth has been revealed." She told them about Hemlock's treachery, about his involvement in the stagecoach robbery, about his framing of Colt. She showed them the confession, the evidence that had been hidden for so long. The crowd listened in stunned silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief, anger, and relief. They had lived under the shadow of the feud for so long, their lives shaped by the lies and deceit of Old Man Hemlock. Now, the truth was out, and the burden of the past was finally lifted. "Colt Dawson is innocent," Carrie said, her voice filled with conviction. "He was framed just like he always said." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. They looked at Colt, his face pale and wounded, but his eyes filled with a quiet dignity. They saw not an outlaw, but a victim, a man who had been wronged, a man who deserved justice. Deputy Thompson stepped forward, his voice firm. "Old Man Hemlock is dead," he said. "He was killed in the shootout. His sons are in custody." The news was met with a mixture of relief and sadness. The Hemlocks had been a part of Serenity for generations, their lives intertwined with the history of the town. But their reign of terror was over. "We need to rebuild," Carrie said, her voice strong and hopeful. "We need to heal the wounds of the past and create a new future, a future based on truth, justice, and unity." Her words resonated with the crowd. They had been divided for too long, their lives consumed by hatred and mistrust. Now they had a chance to start over, to build a better community, a better future. Doc Miller arrived, pushing his way through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. He examined Colt's wound, his expression concerned but professional.
"He'll need stitches," he said, "and rest."
"But he'll be all right." A collective sigh of relief swept through the crowd. They had feared the worst, but Colt had survived. Carrie watched as Doc Miller led Colt away, his arms slung around the doctor's shoulders. She felt a wave of gratitude, of relief, of love. She turned back to the crowd, her eyes meeting theirs. "Let this be a new beginning for Serenity," she said. "Let us learn from the past, and let us build a future worthy of our children and our grandchildren." The townsfolk nodded, their faces reflecting a newfound hope, a renewed sense of community. The unforgiving land had tested them, had tried to break them, but they had endured. And now, they were ready to rebuild, to heal, to create a new legacy for Serenity. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the town, a promise of a new day, a new beginning. Chapter 11. echoes of betrayal. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Colt was confined to bed, recovering from his wound under Doc Miller's watchful eye. Carrie, despite her own injuries, threw herself into the task of restoring order to Serenity. She oversaw the arrest and detention of the remaining Hemlock sons, ensuring they were treated fairly but firmly. She met with the townsfolk, listening to their concerns, reassuring them that the dark days of the feud were over. The confession found in the strongbox, along with Carrie's mother's letter, provided irrefutable proof of Old Man Hemlock's and her father's guilt. It also revealed the names of several other townspeople who had been complicit in the scheme, albeit in minor roles, mostly out of fear or coercion. Carrie handled the situation with a delicate balance of justice and mercy. She ensured that those who had actively participated in the crimes were held accountable, but she also offered understanding and forgiveness to those who had been caught in the crossfire. The town slowly began to heal. The fear and suspicion that had hung heavy in the air for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative sense of hope and unity. People started talking to each other again, sharing their stories, their grief, their relief. Carrie visited Colt every day, spending hours by his bedside, talking, reading, or simply sitting in silence, their hands clasped together. Their bond, forged in the crucible of adversity, had grown stronger than ever. They spoke of the past, of the pain and the betrayal, but they also spoke of the future, of their hopes and dreams for a life together. One afternoon, as Carrie was sitting by Colt's bedside, he stirred and opened his eyes. He looked at her, his gaze filled with a warmth that made her heart ache. "You saved my life, Carrie," he said, his voice weak but sincere. "You saved mine too," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "And Thompson, he was the real hero." "He's a good man," Colt said. "Loyal and brave." "Yes, he is," Carrie agreed. "I owe him a lot." They fell silent for a moment, their thoughts drifting back to the events in the canyon, the near-death experiences, the miraculous escape. "I still can't believe it was Hemlock," Colt said, his voice filled with bitterness. "All these years I thought it was your father, or maybe some other rival rancher." "My father was involved," Carrie said, her voice heavy with sadness. "He was weak, and he was in debt. Hemlock used him, manipulated him." "I'm sorry, Carrie," Colt said, his voice gentle. "I know how much you loved your father." "I loved the man I thought he was," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Not the man he really was." She told him about her mother's letter, about the secret she'd kept for so long, about the burden she'd carried. Colt listened intently, his eyes filled with compassion. He understood the pain of betrayal, the weight of family secrets. "It's over now, Carrie," he said, his voice soothing. "The truth is out. You're free." "I know," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But it's still hard to accept. It's like a part of my life was a lie." "We all have scars, Carrie," he said, his voice soft. "Visible and invisible. They're a part of who we are, but they don't define us." He reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch sending a warmth through her. "We can heal, Carrie," he said. "Together." His words were like a balm to her wounded soul. She looked at him, her eyes meeting his, and saw a reflection of her own pain, her own longing, but also a strength, a resilience, that inspired her. "I love you, Colt," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I love you too, Carrie," he said, his voice husky with emotion. More than words can say. They kissed, a long, tender kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment to each other. It was a kiss of forgiveness, of healing, of hope. As the days turned into weeks, Colt gradually regained his strength. He started walking around, helping out with chores around Doc Miller's house, eager to get back to his life. Carrie continued to oversee the town's recovery, working tirelessly to restore order and rebuild trust. She knew it would take time, but she was confident that Serenity would emerge stronger, more united than ever before. One evening, as Carrie and Colt were sitting on the porch of Doc Miller's house, watching the sunset, they heard the sound of approaching horses. They looked up and saw a group of riders coming towards them, their faces familiar. It was a delegation of townsfolk, led by Martha Jenkins, the owner of the general store. They had come to see Carrie, to offer her their support, their gratitude, and their request. The echoes of betrayal were still present, but a new, stronger sound was beginning to drown them out. The sound of community and hope, of forgiveness. Chapter 12. Crossroads of Fate. The townsfolk gathered around the porch, their faces etched with a mixture of respect, gratitude, and a hint of trepidation. Martha Jenkins stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression serious but kind. "Sheriff Boone," she said, her voice clear and strong, "we've come to thank you for your bravery, your honesty, and your unwavering commitment to justice." The other townsfolk murmured their agreement, their eyes fixed on Carrie, their expressions reflecting their heartfelt appreciation. "You've shown us the truth," Martha continued, "even when it was painful, even when it meant exposing the secrets of your own family. You've risked your life to protect us, to bring peace back to Serenity." Carrie felt a lump form in her throat, her emotions overwhelming her. She hadn't expected this outpouring of support, this acknowledgement of her efforts. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I was just doing my job." "No, Sheriff," Martha said, her voice firm. "You were doing more than your job. You were being a leader, a true representative of this town." She paused, taking a deep breath, and then continued. "We've talked amongst ourselves," she said, "and we've come to a decision. We want you to remain our sheriff." Carrie was stunned. She'd expected some resistance, some resentment, especially from those who had been close to the Hemlocks or who had harbored doubts about Colt. "But what about Colt?" she asked, her voice hesitant.
He was an outlaw."
"He was a wrongly accused man," Martha said, her voice unwavering. "And he's proven his innocence. He's also proven his courage, his loyalty, and his love for you and for this town." The townsfolk nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting their acceptance of Colt, their willingness to forgive his past and embrace his future. "We believe you two can lead us," Martha said, her voice filled with hope. "Together, you can help us rebuild, heal, and create a better future for Serenity." Carrie looked at Colt, his face etched with surprise and a hint of uncertainty. He hadn't expected this either. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of love, pride, and a quiet determination. He knew this was a crossroads, a pivotal moment in their lives. "It's up to you, Carrie," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I'll support whatever decision you make." Carrie looked back at the townsfolk, their faces filled with hope and expectation. She thought about the challenges ahead, the difficulties they would face, the work that needed to be done. But she also thought about the strength of the community, the resilience of the human spirit, the power of love and forgiveness. She knew what she had to do. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing out across the square. "I will remain your sheriff. And I will do everything in my power to serve this town, to protect its people, and to uphold the law." A cheer erupted from the crowd, their voices filled with relief and joy. They had their sheriff back, and they had a new leader in Colt, a man who had proven his worth, a man who had earned their trust. Carrie turned to Colt, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. He smiled, his gaze filled with love and admiration. They embraced, a long, tender embrace that sealed their commitment to each other, to the town, to the future. The crossroads had been reached, the decision made. They had chosen to stay in Serenity, to face the challenges together, to build a new life, a new legacy. It was a daunting task, but they were ready. They had each other, they had the support of the community, and they had the truth on their side. As the townsfolk dispersed, their hearts filled with hope and gratitude, Carrie and Colt remained on the porch, their arms wrapped around each other, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. The vast, unforgiving land stretched out before them. They had hard choices ahead, defining their roles, deciding on their place within the repaired but forever changed community. But they had love, newfound respect, and a town that finally believed in them. The future was uncertain, but it was also filled with possibilities. And they would face it together, hand in hand, their hearts united, their spirits strong. Chapter 13. The Dance of Deception. The weeks following the town's vote of confidence were a whirlwind of activity. Carrie, officially reinstated as sheriff, worked tirelessly to re-establish order and implement much-needed reforms. Colt, now fully recovered, became her unofficial deputy, his sharp instincts and knowledge of the outlaw world proving invaluable. While the Hemlocks' direct threat was extinguished, the tendrils of their influence reached deeper into Serenity than Carrie had initially realized. Several prominent citizens, including the town's banker, Mr. Abernathy, and the owner of the largest ranch, Mr. Sterling, were implicated in the confession, albeit indirectly. They provided financial backing to Hemlock, ostensibly for legitimate business ventures, but with a tacit understanding that some of the funds would be used for illicit activities. Carrie knew she had to tread carefully. These men were powerful and influential, and accusing them outright could destabilize the fragile peace that had settled over Serenity. She needed concrete proof, something beyond the vague mentions in Hemlock's confession. She and Colt began a covert investigation, poring over old ledgers, interviewing witnesses, and piecing together the fragmented evidence. It was a delicate dance of deception, a game of cat and mouse played out in the shadows of the town. One evening, as they were working late in the sheriff's office, poring over Abernathy's banking records, Colt noticed a pattern of unusual transactions. Large sums of money had been withdrawn from Hemlock's account and deposited into seemingly unrelated accounts, only to be withdrawn again shortly thereafter. "Look at this, Carrie," Colt said, his voice low and urgent. "These accounts, they're all shell corporations, owned by Sterling." Carrie leaned closer, her brow furrowed in concentration. She traced the flow of money, her mind racing, connecting the dots. "Sterling," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was Hemlock's silent partner. He was the one who profited from the robbery, from the land grabs, from everything." It made sense. Sterling had always been envious of the Boone family's land, their water rights. He'd been a close friend of Carrie's father, a seemingly loyal supporter, but all the while, he'd been plotting, scheming, using Hemlock as his puppet. "We need to confront him," Colt said, his voice grim. "We need to bring him to justice." "Not yet," Carrie said, her voice cautious. "We need more proof. He's too powerful, too well-connected. He'll deny everything, and we'll be back to square one." They decided to focus on Abernathy, the banker. He was the weaker link, the one more likely to crack under pressure. They brought him in for questioning, presenting him with the evidence of the suspicious transactions. Abernathy, a nervous, fidgety man, initially denied any involvement, but as Carrie and Colt pressed him, he began to crumble. He confessed to laundering money for Hemlock and Sterling, claiming he'd been forced to do it, threatened with ruin if he refused. He provided them with detailed information about Sterling's involvement, confirming their suspicions. With Abernathy's testimony, Carrie had the proof she needed. She issued a warrant for Sterling's arrest, and she and Colt, along with Deputy Thompson, rode out to his ranch, prepared for a confrontation. Sterling was a wealthy and influential man, and his ranch was a testament to his power. It was a sprawling estate, with a large, imposing house, numerous outbuildings, and vast herds of cattle grazing on the rolling hills. As they approached the house, they were met by a group of Sterling's ranch hands, armed and hostile. They were loyal to their employer, and they were ready to defend him, even against the law. "We're here for Sterling," Carrie said, her voice calm but firm. "We have a warrant for his arrest." The ranch hands hesitated, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. They knew Carrie. They respected her, but they were also bound by their loyalty to Sterling. "He's not here," one of the ranch hands said, his voice defiant. "He's gone away on business." Carrie knew he was lying. She could see the fear in his eyes, the way he avoided her gaze. "We're going to search the house," she said, her voice unwavering. "And if you try to stop us, you'll be arrested too." The ranch hands reluctantly stood aside, allowing Carrie and Colt to enter the house. The interior was opulent, decorated with expensive furniture, fine art, and hunting trophies. It was a stark contrast to the simple, rustic homes of the other townsfolk. They searched the house thoroughly, their senses on high alert, expecting Sterling to appear at any moment, armed and dangerous. They found him in his study, sitting at his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a look of defiance on his face. "Well, Sheriff," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe this intrusion?" "You're under arrest," Sterling, Carrie said, her voice cold and hard. "For conspiracy, theft, and obstruction of justice." Sterling laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You have nothing on me, Sheriff," he said. "Just the word of a sniveling banker and a convicted outlaw." "We have more than that," Colt said, his voice grim. "We have the truth." He stepped forward, placing the Hemlock Confession and Abernathy's testimony on the desk in front of Sterling. Sterling's face paled. He glanced at the documents, his eyes widening in disbelief. He'd underestimated them. He thought he was untouchable, but now his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. He reached for a drawer in his desk, his hand moving with surprising speed. Carrie reacted instantly, drawing her revolver and pointing it at him. "Don't do it, Sterling," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's over." He hesitated, his hand hovering over the drawer, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and desperation. He knew he was cornered, that he had no escape. Slowly, he withdrew his hand, empty. He slumped back in his chair, his shoulders slumping, his spirit broken. The dance of deception was over. The truth had been revealed, and justice would be served. As Carrie and Colt led Sterling away, the full moon cast long, stark shadows. The deception had been intricate, but even in a town built on secrets, the truth had a way of finding the light. Chapter 14. A Glimmer of Hope. Sterling's arrest sent shockwaves through Serenity. The man who had once been considered a pillar of the community, a respected rancher and businessman, was now revealed to be a criminal, a conspirator in a decades-long scheme of theft and deceit. The townsfolk reacted with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and a sense of betrayal. They had trusted Sterling, they had looked up to him, and now they learned that he had been manipulating them, profiting from their misfortune. Carrie understood their feelings. She too had been deceived. She too had felt the sting of betrayal. But she knew that dwelling on the past would not help them move forward. They needed to focus on healing, on rebuilding, on creating a new future for Serenity. Sterling's trial was swift and decisive. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his ill-gotten gains confiscated and returned to their rightful owners. Abernathy, the banker, was also convicted, but his sentence was lighter, in recognition of his cooperation with the authorities. He was stripped of his position and banished from Serenity, his reputation forever tarnished. With Sterling and Abernathy out of the picture, Carrie and Colt turned their attention to restoring the town's economy and rebuilding trust among the citizens. They worked tirelessly, implementing new policies, promoting fair trade, and encouraging community involvement. They organized town meetings, where people could voice their concerns, share their ideas, and participate in the decision-making process. They established a community fund, using some of the recovered money from Sterling's assets to help those who had been affected by the past injustices. Slowly but surely, Serenity began to recover. The wounds of the past were still there, but they were starting to heal. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion was replaced by a sense of hope and optimism. Carrie and Colt's relationship also blossomed. They were no longer just partners in upholding the law, they were partners in life, their love for each other deepening with each passing day. They spent their evenings together, sharing meals, talking, laughing, and planning their future. They dreamed of building a home, raising a family, and growing old together in Serenity. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of Carrie's small house, watching the sunset, Colt turned to her, his eyes filled with a love that made her heart ache. "Carrie," he said, his voice soft and tender, "will you marry me?" Carrie's breath caught in her throat. She had been hoping for this, dreaming of this, but hearing the words spoken aloud still took her breath away. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of joy, of gratitude, of a love that had endured the test of time. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Colt, I will marry you." He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, his touch sending a warmth through her. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, tender kiss that sealed their promise, their commitment to each other. They were married a few weeks later, in a simple ceremony held in the town square, surrounded by the people of Serenity, their friends, their family, their community. It was a joyous occasion, a celebration of love, of redemption, of a new beginning. The town had been through so much, endured so much pain, but now, they were finally able to look forward to a brighter future. Carrie and Colt stood hand in hand, their hearts filled with happiness and hope. They had found their way back to each other, against all odds, and they were ready to start their new life together. The vast expanse of the desert, which once felt barren and unforgiving, now held beauty. The glimmer of hope had become a radiant glow. As they exchanged their vows, the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple, a breathtaking backdrop to their love story. It was a perfect ending to a long and difficult journey and a perfect beginning to a new chapter in their lives. Chapter 15. Reckoning at Dawn. Life in Serenity settled into a peaceful rhythm after Colt and Carrie's wedding. The town, once fractured by feuds and secrets, was slowly knitting itself back together. Colt, officially appointed as Carrie's deputy, proved to be a capable and respected lawman, his past forgiven, if not entirely forgotten, by the townsfolk. However, the echoes of the past still lingered. The Hemlock sons, imprisoned for their role in the attack at Devil's Spine, were a constant reminder of the violence and hatred that had once consumed Serenity. While Old Man Hemlock was dead and Sterling was behind bars, there were still loose ends, whispers of other accomplices who had managed to escape justice. One crisp autumn morning, a rider arrived in Serenity, bearing a message for Sheriff Boone. It was a letter from a neighboring town, a plea for assistance. A gang of outlaws, known for their ruthlessness and brutality, had been terrorizing the region, robbing stagecoaches, and raiding isolated ranches. The letter identified the leader of the gang as a man named Razor Rayburn, a notorious criminal with a long history of violence. But what caught Carrie's attention was a detail mentioned almost as an afterthought. One of Rayburn's lieutenants was described as a young man, matching the description of one of the Hemlock sons who'd been involved in the least heinous crimes. A young man that Carrie had made the controversial decision to release on a probationary agreement, believing he was more a victim of his family's influence than a true criminal. Carrie felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Had she made a mistake? Had her desire for reconciliation blinded her to the potential danger? She showed the letter to Colt, his face hardening as he read it. "It seems your faith in young Hemlock was misplaced," he said, his voice grim. "I was wrong," Carrie admitted, her voice heavy with regret. "I let my hope for peace cloud my judgment." "We all make mistakes, Carrie," Colt said, his voice softening. "The important thing is to learn from them." They knew they had to act quickly. Rayburn's gang was a threat not only to the neighboring towns, but to Serenity as well. If young Hemlock was involved, it was only a matter of time before they turned their attention to their old stomping grounds. Carrie and Colt decided to ride out to the neighboring town, to offer their assistance, and to gather more information about Rayburn's gang. They left Deputy Thompson in charge of Serenity, instructing him to be vigilant and to keep a close watch on the remaining Hemlock sympathizers. The journey was long and arduous, the landscape harsh and unforgiving. As they rode, Carrie couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense that she was riding towards a reckoning, a confrontation with the ghosts of the past. They arrived in the neighboring town, a small, dusty settlement that bore the scars of Rayburn's recent attacks. The townsfolk were fearful and demoralized, their homes and businesses damaged, their spirits broken. Carrie and Colt met with a local sheriff, a weary, disheartened man who was overwhelmed by the situation. He provided them with more details about Rayburn's gang, confirming that young Hemlock was indeed one of his lieutenants. He's changed, Sheriff Boone, the local sheriff said, his voice filled with sadness. He's become hardened, cruel. He's not the young man you knew. Carrie felt a pang of guilt, a sharp reminder of her own responsibility. She had given young Hemlock a second chance, and he had thrown it away, choosing a life of violence and crime. They spent the next few days tracking Rayburn's gang, following their trail of destruction, gathering information from witnesses and informants. They learned that Rayburn was planning a major robbery, targeting a stagecoach carrying a large shipment of gold. Carrie and Colt knew they had to stop him. They devised a plan, a daring ambush, to intercept the stagecoach and capture Rayburn and his gang. The reckoning came at dawn, in a narrow canyon, the same canyon where a stage was robbed all of those years ago. The rising sun cast long, eerie shadows. The air was cool and crisp, the silence broken only by the sound of the approaching stagecoach. Carrie and Colt, along with a small posse of local lawmen, lay in wait, hidden among the rocks, their rifles ready. As the stagecoach entered the canyon, Rayburn and his gang emerged from their hiding places, their weapons drawn. They were a ruthless-looking bunch, hardened criminals, their faces etched with violence and greed. And there, among them, was young Hemlock, his eyes cold and hard, his face bearing a cruel sneer. He looked nothing like the young man Carrie had tried to help, the young man she had believed could be redeemed. "Hold it right there, Rayburn," Carrie shouted, her voice echoing through the canyon. "You're surrounded." The outlaws froze, their eyes darting around, searching for the source of the voice. They were caught off guard, trapped in the ambush. "It's the sheriff," one of the outlaws shouted. "It's Boone." Young Hemlock's eyes met Carrie's, his expression filled with a mixture of hatred and defiance. "You should have stayed out of this, Sheriff," he snarled. "This ain't your fight." "It is my fight," Carrie said, her voice firm. "I made a mistake, and now I'm here to correct it." The canyon erupted in gunfire. The final threads of the past had to be faced. There could be no true peace until the last echoes of violence and betrayal were silenced. Chapter 16. The Weight of Redemption. The canyon echoed with the deafening roar of gunfire, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the cries of men. Carrie and Colt, along with their posse, returned fire, their shots precise and deadly. The outlaws, caught in the ambush, fought back fiercely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. They fell one by one, their bodies crumpling to the ground, their weapons silenced. Carrie focused on young Hemlock, her heart aching with a mixture of regret and determination. She had to stop him. She had to bring him to justice, even if it meant taking his life. She saw him take cover behind a large boulder, his rifle blazing, his eyes filled with a cold, hard fury. He had become everything she had hoped he wouldn't be, a ruthless outlaw, a symbol of the violence and hatred that had once consumed Serenity.
"Hemlock,"
she shouted, her voice rising above the din of the battle. "Surrender. It's over." He responded with a volley of shots, his bullets whizzing past her head. He was beyond reason, beyond redemption, lost in the darkness of his own making. Carrie knew she had no choice. She raised her revolver, her finger tightening on the trigger, her heart heavy with sorrow. But before she could fire, Colt stepped in front of her, his body shielding hers. "No, Carrie," he said, his voice firm. "Let me handle this." He moved towards Hemlock's position, his revolver held low, his eyes fixed on the young outlaw.
"Hemlock,"
he shouted. "It's Colt.
"Put down your weapon."
Hemlock emerged from behind the boulder, his rifle still raised, his face contorted with rage.
"Dawson,"
he snarled. "You're a traitor. You turned your back on your own kind." "I chose a different path, Hemlock," Colt said, his voice calm but firm. "A path of justice, of peace. You can still choose that path too." "It's too late for me, Dawson," Hemlock said, his voice filled with despair. "I'm in too deep." "It's never too late, Hemlock," Colt said. "Put down your gun. Surrender. I promise you'll get a fair trial." Hemlock hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. He looked at Colt, his former friend, his former rival, and saw not an enemy, but a man of integrity, a man who had found redemption. For a moment, it seemed as if he might surrender, as if he might choose a different path. But then his eyes hardened, his grip tightening on his rifle. "I can't," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I won't." He raised his rifle, aiming at Colt. Carrie cried out, her heart leaping into her throat.
But Colt was faster.
He fired his revolver, the shot echoing through the canyon. Hemlock stumbled backward, clutching his chest, his rifle falling from his grasp. He collapsed to the ground, his eyes wide with shock and pain. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall, surrendered, throwing down their weapons, their faces filled with fear and resignation. The battle was over. The canyon fell silent, the only sound the moaning of the wounded and the ragged breathing of the survivors. Carrie rushed to Colt's side, her heart pounding in her chest. He was unharmed, his face grim but resolute. They knelt beside Hemlock, his life ebbing away. He looked at Carrie, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and gratitude. "I'm sorry, Sheriff," he whispered, his voice barely audible.
"For everything."
And then he was gone. The last of the Hemlock sons, the final vestige of the old feud, was dead. Carrie felt a wave of sadness wash over her, a profound sense of loss. She had failed him. She had failed to save him from the darkness. But she also felt a sense of relief, a sense of closure. The cycle of violence had been broken. The weight of redemption had been heavy, but it had finally lifted. They buried Hemlock in the canyon, alongside the other fallen outlaws. It was a simple, unmarked grave, a testament to the futility of violence, the tragedy of wasted lives. It was not the ending Carrie wanted, but it was, perhaps, the ending that was necessary. As they rode back to Serenity, Carrie and Colt were silent, each lost in their own thoughts, their own emotions. The weight of redemption was heavy, but it was a weight they were willing to bear, together. Chapter 17. Fractured Trust. The return to Serenity was somber. While the immediate threat of Razor Rayburn's gang was eliminated, and young Hemlock's death marked a definitive end to the family feud, a sense of unease lingered. Carrie's decision to release young Hemlock, however well-intentioned, had resulted in further violence and loss of life. It was a decision that haunted her, and she knew it had fractured the trust some townsfolk had placed in her. She and Colt were greeted with a mixture of relief and subdued apprehension. The news of the shootout had reached Serenity ahead of them, and while most were grateful for the outlaws' defeat, there were whispers, questions about Carrie's judgment. Martha Jenkins, ever the voice of reason, met them at the edge of town. "Sheriff," she said, her expression somber, "we're glad you're both safe. But there are concerns. About young Hemlock. About your decision to let him go." Carrie sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I know, Martha. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake." "We understand your intentions, Sheriff," Martha said, her voice softening. "You wanted peace. You wanted to believe in the best of people. But some folks are saying you were too lenient, too trusting." "They're right," Carrie said, her voice heavy with regret. "I should have listened to my instincts. I should have kept him locked up." "It's done," Carrie, Colt said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We can't change the past. We can only learn from it." "But how do I regain their trust, Colt?" Carrie asked, her voice filled with despair. "How do I convince them that I'm still capable of leading this town?" "By continuing to do your job," Carrie, Colt said, his voice firm. "By showing them that you're committed to justice, to the safety and well-being of Serenity." The following days were difficult. Carrie faced criticism, both open and veiled. Some townsfolk avoided her gaze, their expressions filled with doubt and disapproval. Others were more vocal, questioning her decisions, challenging her authority. She understood their anger, their disappointment. She had made a mistake, and it had cost lives. She had to earn back their trust, brick by brick, action by action. She threw herself into her work, redoubling her efforts to maintain order and enforce the law. She investigated every complaint, no matter how small. She addressed every concern, no matter how trivial. She was determined to prove that she was still the same sheriff they had once trusted, the same sheriff who had brought down Sterling and Old Man Hemlock. Colt stood by her side, unwavering in his support. He helped her with her investigations, he offered her counsel, and he defended her against her critics. He was her rock, her anchor, her constant source of strength and encouragement. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of their small house, watching the sunset, Carrie turned to Colt, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can do this, Colt," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can win them back." "You can, Carrie," Colt said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're strong, you're resilient, and you're a good sheriff. You just need to give them time. Time to heal, time to forgive, time to trust you again." He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, his touch sending a warmth through her. "We'll do it together, Carrie," he said. "We'll face this challenge, just like we've faced every other challenge. Together." His words gave her hope, a renewed sense of determination. She knew he was right. She couldn't give up. She had to keep fighting, not only for herself, but for the town, for the people she had sworn to protect. The fractured trust was a painful wound, but it was not a fatal one. It would take time, patience, and unwavering commitment, but she was confident that she could heal the rift, that she could regain the trust of the townsfolk. The desert sky was ablaze with color, the setting sun painting the clouds in hues of orange, red, and purple. It was a beautiful sight, a reminder of the beauty and resilience of the land, of the people who called it home. Carrie leaned her head on Colt's shoulder, drawing strength from his presence, his love. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was not alone. She had Colt, she had her own inner strength, and she had a renewed commitment to serving Serenity, to being the best sheriff she could be. The fractures were there, but beneath them, the foundation of her resolve remained strong. Chapter 18. The Ties That Bind. The weeks that followed were a testament to Carrie's resilience and Colt's unwavering support. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to mend the fractured trust within Serenity. Carrie made it a point to be visible and accessible, addressing concerns directly and honestly. She held town meetings not just to discuss official business, but to listen, to truly hear the fears and hopes of the people she served. Colt, as her deputy, became a bridge between Carrie and the more skeptical townsfolk. His quiet strength and his own journey of redemption resonated with many who had doubted him in the past. He spoke with those who had been closest to the Hemlocks, offering understanding but firmly condemning the violence that had plagued their town. One significant step towards healing came with the unexpected arrival of Sarah Hemlock, young Hemlock's widow. She was a quiet, unassuming woman, carrying a young child, a babe in arms. Many expected Carrie to turn her away, to hold her responsible for her husband's actions. Instead, Carrie welcomed her. She offered Sarah a place to stay, assistance in finding work, and, most importantly, a promise that her child would not be judged for the sins of his father. This act of compassion, witnessed by the entire town, did more to heal the rift than any speech or apology could have. It demonstrated Carrie's commitment to justice, tempered with mercy and understanding. It showed that she was not interested in perpetuating the cycle of hatred and revenge, but in building a new future for Serenity, a future where even the families of former enemies could find a place. Sarah Hemlock, initially wary and distrustful, slowly began to open up to Carrie. She revealed that she had never approved of her husband's involvement with Razor Rayburn, that she had pleaded with him to leave the gang, to return to Serenity and seek forgiveness. He wouldn't listen, Sarah said, her voice filled with sadness. He was too caught up in the anger, in the need for revenge. "I understand," Carrie said, her voice gentle. "I know how powerful those feelings can be." Sarah looked at Carrie, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and respect. "You're a good woman, Sheriff Boone," she said. "You're a fair woman. I'm sorry for what my husband did." "We all make mistakes," Carrie said. "The important thing is to learn from them, to move forward." Sarah's presence in Serenity, and Carrie's acceptance of her, became a symbol of healing, of reconciliation. It showed that even the deepest wounds could be healed, that even the most bitter enemies could find common ground. As the months passed, the atmosphere in Serenity continued to improve. The fear and suspicion that had lingered after young Hemlock's death gradually dissipated, replaced by a sense of hope and optimism. The townsfolk began to work together to rebuild their community, to create a better future for themselves and their children. Carrie and Colt, their bond strengthened by the challenges they had faced, continued to lead Serenity with courage, compassion, and unwavering commitment. They were not just law enforcers, they were community builders, peacemakers, symbols of hope. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of their house, watching the sunset, Carrie turned to Colt, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Thank you, Colt," she said, her voice soft and tender. "For everything. For standing by me, for believing in me, for helping me heal this town." "We did it together," Colt said, his voice equally soft. "We faced the challenges together, and we overcame them together." He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, his touch sending a warmth through her. "We're a team, Carrie," he said. "Always." They kissed, a long, tender kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment to each other, to Serenity, to the future. The ties that bound them together, love, trust, loyalty, and a shared commitment to justice, were stronger than ever. They had weathered the storms, they had faced the darkness, and they had emerged victorious. The desert sky was ablaze with color, the setting sun painting the clouds in hues of gold, crimson, and violet. It was a breathtaking sight, a symbol of hope, of renewal, of a new beginning. Serenity, once a town fractured by feuds and secrets, was now a community united, healed, and ready to face the future with courage and optimism. The ties that bound them were not just those of law and order, but of forgiveness, compassion, and a shared commitment to building a better life for all. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer held them captive. They were free. Chapter 19. A Love Forged in Fire. Life in Serenity continued to flourish. Under Carrie and Colt's leadership, the town prospered. New businesses opened, families grew, and a sense of community spirit thrived. The scars of the past remained, a reminder of the hardships they had endured, but they served as a testament to their resilience, their ability to overcome adversity. Carrie and Colt, deeply in love and committed to each other, found joy in their work and in their growing family. They had a daughter, a bright, spirited girl named Hope, who embodied the promise of Serenity's future. They built a life together, a life filled with love, laughter, and a shared commitment to justice. They were not just law enforcers, they were mentors, friends, and pillars of the community. One sunny afternoon, as Carrie and Colt were riding through the outskirts of town, they came across a group of children playing near the old, abandoned Hemlock Ranch. The ranch, once a symbol of hatred and division, had fallen into disrepair, a testament to the destructive power of the feud. The children were playing a game of sheriff and outlaws, their voices filled with laughter and excitement. Carrie and Colt watched them, their hearts filled with a mixture of amusement and a quiet sense of satisfaction. "Look at them, Colt," Carrie said, her voice soft and tender. "They're playing our story, but without the pain, without the hatred." "They're rewriting the ending," Colt said, his voice equally soft. "They're creating a new narrative." As they watched the children, Carrie noticed one small boy, sitting alone, watching the others with a wistful expression. He was Sarah Hemlock's son, a quiet, introspective child who carried the weight of his family's legacy. Carrie dismounted and walked towards the boy, her heart filled with compassion. "Hello," she said, her voice gentle. "What's your name?" "Thomas," the boy said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's a nice day to play, Thomas," Carrie said. "Why don't you join the others?" He shook his head, his eyes downcast.
"They don't want me," he said.
"They say I'm a Hemlock." Carrie felt a pang of sadness, a reminder of the lingering prejudice that still existed, despite their best efforts. She knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Thomas," she said, her voice firm but kind, "you are not your father. You are not your grandfather. You are you. And you are welcome in serenity. She stood up and called out to the other children. Come here, everyone, she said. I want to introduce you to Thomas. He's new to our town and he needs some friends. The children, initially hesitant, slowly approached. Carrie encouraged them to include Thomas in their game, to show him kindness and acceptance. Slowly, tentatively, the children began to interact with Thomas, inviting him to join their play. He smiled, a shy, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. Carrie watched them, her heart filled with hope. It was a small victory, but a significant one. It was a sign that the wounds of the past were finally healing, that the cycle of hatred and prejudice was being broken. As she and Colt rode back to town, the sun setting in a blaze of glory, Carrie felt a profound sense of peace, of contentment. They had built a life together, a life forged in fire, tested by adversity, but ultimately triumphant. Their love for each other, their commitment to justice, and their unwavering belief in the power of redemption had transformed Serenity, turning a town once torn apart by feuds and secrets into a community united, healed, and filled with hope. They had faced their demons, they had confronted their past, and they had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more deeply in love than ever before. Their love was a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a symbol of the brighter future that awaited Serenity.
It was more than just a romance.
It was a partnership, forged in the harsh realities of the frontier, tempered by adversity, and ultimately, triumphant. The desert stretched before them, vast and beautiful. The love they shared glowed brighter than any sunset, a testament to their journey. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Years passed, painting Serenity with the gentle brushstrokes of time. Carrie and Colt, their hair now streaked with silver, remained the steadfast heart of the town. Hope, their daughter, had grown into a young woman, inheriting her mother's courage and her father's quiet strength. She was the embodiment of Serenity's new generation, a generation free from the feuds and hatreds of the past. One day, a stranger rode into town. He was an older man, his face weathered and lined, his eyes holding a haunted look. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, but there was a weariness about him, a sense of burdens carried for too long. He stopped in front of the sheriff's office, dismounted, and walked inside. Carrie, now a seasoned sheriff with decades of experience, looked up from her desk, her gaze sharp and assessing. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "I'm looking for Sheriff Boone," the man said, his voice raspy and hesitant. "I am Sheriff Boone," Carrie replied. The man's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He had clearly expected someone else, someone older, perhaps a man. I need to confess," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Carrie's instincts sharpened. She gestured for him to sit down, her gaze never leaving his face. "Confess to what?" she asked, her voice steady. The man hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. He took a deep breath and began to speak. He revealed that he was one of the original stagecoach robbers, a member of the gang that had framed Colt Dawson all those years ago. He had been a young man then, caught up in the excitement, the greed, the promise of easy money. He had escaped the shootout at the Devil's Spine, fleeing into the wilderness, living a life of hiding, of regret, of constant fear. He had carried the burden of his guilt for decades, haunted by the memory of the innocent man he had helped to frame. "I heard about what happened here," he said, his voice filled with remorse. "About how you and Dawson cleared his name, exposed Hemlock and Sterling. I knew I had to come forward, to confess my part in it." Carrie listened intently, her mind racing. This was unexpected, a ghost from the past emerging from the shadows. "Why now?" she asked, her voice probing. "Why, after all these years?" "I'm dying," the man said, his voice weak. "I have a sickness that can't be cured. I want to make peace with my past, with my conscience, before it's too late." Carrie studied him, her eyes searching his face, trying to discern the truth from the lies. She saw the weariness, the regret, the fear of death, But she also saw a flicker of hope, a desire for redemption. She believed him. She called Colt into the office, explaining the situation. Colt listened to the man's confession, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and a quiet understanding. He had lived with the consequences of this man's actions for years, enduring the stigma of being an outlaw, the pain of betrayal, the loss of his freedom. But he had also found redemption. He had found love. He had built a new life. He had no desire for revenge, for retribution. "What do you want us to do?" Colt asked the man, his voice calm. "I want to tell the truth," the man said. "I want to make a formal confession, to clear Dawson's name completely, to ensure that there are no lingering doubts, no shadows of suspicion." Carrie and Colt exchanged a look. They knew what they had to do. They took the man's confession, documenting it carefully, ensuring that every detail was recorded. They then arranged for him to be seen by Doc Miller, who confirmed his illness. The man died a few weeks later, peacefully, in his sleep. He had found a measure of redemption, a release from the burden of his past. Carrie and Colt shared the man's confession with the townsfolk, a final act of closure, a final step in healing the wounds of the past. The news was met with a quiet understanding, a sense of completion. Colt Dawson's name was now completely cleared, his innocence unequivocally established. The last shadow of doubt had been removed. As the sun set on Serenity, casting a golden glow over the town, Carrie and Colt stood on the porch of their home, their arms wrapped around each other, their hearts filled with peace. They had faced their final confrontation, not with guns and violence, but with truth and forgiveness. They had conquered the ghosts of the past, not with hatred and revenge, but with compassion and understanding. It was the last, necessary act to cement the change in Serenity. The final conflict had come not with a bang, but with the quiet whisper of a dying man. The horizon stretched vast before them, painted in hues of serenity. Their hearts, once fractured, now beat as one, a testament to their enduring love, their unwavering commitment to justice, and their triumph over adversity. It was a final, quiet affirmation of the new life they had built and the legacy they would leave behind. Epilogue. The years continued their relentless march, transforming Serenity once more. Carrie and Colt eventually retired, passing the torch of law enforcement to a new generation, a generation that included their own daughter, Hope, who became a deputy, carrying on her parents' legacy of courage and compassion. The town prospered, growing larger, more diverse, but it never forgot its roots, its history of feuds and secrets, of violence and redemption. The stories of Carrie and Colt became legends, whispered around campfires, recounted in hushed tones in the saloons, passed down from parents to children. They became symbols of hope, of justice, of the enduring power of love in the face of adversity. Their names were etched in the heart of Serenity, a permanent reminder of the courage, the resilience, and the unwavering commitment to truth that had saved the town from itself. Carrie and Colt lived long and fulfilling lives, surrounded by their family, their friends, and the grateful community they had served so faithfully. They watched their children and grandchildren grow, taking pride in their accomplishments, their contributions to Serenity's continued prosperity. They often walked together, hand in hand, through the town square, their steps slower now, their hair white as snow, but their eyes still shining with the same love, the same quiet strength that had sustained them through the years. They would pause by the old jailhouse, a relic of the past, a reminder of the dark days they had overcome. They would look out at the vast expanse of the desert, the same desert that had once seemed so unforgiving, so hostile, but now felt like home, a sanctuary, a place of peace and beauty. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over Serenity, Carrie and Colt sat on their porch, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with a profound sense of contentment. They had lived a full life, a life of adventure, of challenges, of love, and of loss. They had faced their demons, they had conquered their fears, and they had emerged victorious. They had built a a legacy of justice, of compassion, of unwavering commitment to truth. They had transformed Serenity, turning a town torn apart by hatred and violence into a community united, healed, and filled with hope. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Carrie leaned her head on Colt's shoulder, her voice soft and filled with love. "We did it, Colt," she said. "We built a good life." "We did," Colt replied, his voice equally soft. "A good life together." They sat in silence, their hearts overflowing with gratitude, with peace, with a love that had endured the test of time, a love that would last forever. The desert wind whispered around them, a gentle lullaby, a song of love, of redemption, of a life well lived. The vast, starlit sky stretched above them, a silent witness to their enduring legacy, their final P.